Today, I'm going to teach you some basic tips and tricks on how to paint miniatures. This is one of the easiest and most fun ways that you can bring your gaming alive. The first step in painting your miniature is to ensure that you have a decent undercoat or a primer coat. What you're going to do is take a basic white spray paint. A lot of modeling and miniature stores will sell basic primer coats that are specifically designed for miniatures. What you're looking for is a very, very light coat to dust over the miniature. The thicker the paint gets, the more detail that you are going to lose. So always try to use the appropriate base primer coat. If you're new to miniature painting, I would always recommend using a nice white base coat, undercoat. In this example, we have a Dungeons and Dragons Umber Hulk. These models are very inexpensive and they also come pre-primed. You can directly start painting them. They're a great place to start. First thing you want to do is set up your painting area. Just take a couple pieces of white printer paper, stick them onto the table that you're going to be using to paint. This is going to protect the surface of the table from the paint, from splatter, and you can also use it to wipe your brushes on. Various painting techniques. You're going to sometimes mix paints. You can do it directly on this piece of paper. You can also use dry brushing techniques in which you're going to be wiping some of the paint off the brush. You can use this piece of paper as well. Something else that I really like about using the bright white paper is that when you're trying to figure out what it's going to look like on the model, you can take just a little dab of the paint out of the container and you can wipe it on this white piece of paper. It will give you a better representation of what the paint is actually going to look like on the miniature. A lot of times it's really disarming. It's really hard to tell when you just open up the paint container. Usually it's a lot darker than you think it's going to turn out. So you can take a couple dabs of the paint, put it on this white piece of paper. It'll give you a better representation of what it's going to look like. Step 2 is that you want to get your brushes out for the paint job itself. When you're first starting out, I recommend just 3 brushes in general, and these can be purchased from a host of different vendors. The ones that I use are typically Games Workshop. So your first brush is going to be sort of a standard brush, and it's going to have a sort of flexible set of bristles that are very soft, and you can actually form it into a point by rolling it through your fingers. These brushes are going to be applying paint to the larger areas. And once we're done with that, then we're going to move on to a smaller sort of detail brush. This brush itself, and it's kind of hard to tell, it has a very, very fine set of bristles at the end of it, and you can form it into a point by rolling it through your fingers. This is going to be used for those fine little details after you've painted the majority of the areas. And then finally, I recommend having a dry brush in your arsenal. This thing is a little bit damaged, which is fine. When you use it a lot, it starts to splay out a little bit and the bristles get a little wild looking. This brush is going to be for highlights along ridges and edges. And toward the end of the paint experience, we're going to be putting some paint on this. We're going to be wiping it onto our palette, so we just have a very small amount of paint on this brush, and then we're going to use it to highlight some of the edges on the miniature. Next, we're going to focus on color selection. So I'm going to go ahead and just show you really quickly a good way to do it. So I'm going to take my standard brush. I'm going to simply dip it into one of my colors. I'm going to wipe some of the excess paint on the edge, and then I'm just going to paint it onto the palette itself. What I'm doing is I'm kind of seeing what this color is going to potentially look like when I place it on the miniature. So I'm going to do this a couple more times, and then we're going to make a color selection. So what I've done in 3 different locations here on the piece of paper, I just took a dab of the paint and I put it actually out onto the paper to kind of simulate what it'll look like potentially when it's on the miniature. One thing I want to recommend is that go with a lighter color initially. If we look at this one on the right, it's very, very dark. A lot of the detail is going to be lost by adding a paint that's too dark from the outset. So when you're painting, always try to go a little bit lighter. So in these other 2 cases, I kind of like it. You have this lighter brown color, then you have this sort of nasty, disgusting looking green color. The Umber Hulk is an insect type creature from Dungeons and Dragons. So kind of just looking at this set of color patterns, I'm leaning more toward this grotesque insect-like color. I think it will make a nice combination. Another thing I want to note is the paints that I'm going to be using for the base coat are very, very watery, very, very soupy, very thin, not very dense. And the reason why I'm doing this is that I want all of those colors to soak into the cracks and to soak into the detail on this model itself. So as you can see, there's some locations on its back where you have different ridges and the armor plates are coming together. You have some battle damage right here. If I use a very, very thin paint, it's going to soak into all those cracks and crevices, and you're not going to lose that detail. So what I'm going to recommend is the lighter the paint, the less dense the paint. That's really where you want to start. If you want to finish the model using some heavier, thicker paints, that's definitely fine, kind of for those fine details. But at the beginning, I always recommend using a lighter, thin paint. Now we're going to start painting the miniature itself. And what we're going to do is we're going to take just our standard brush. We're going to dip it into the paint. And as I mentioned before, this is a very thin, watery paint. I'm going to wipe the excess off on the side of the container. I'm just going to put a dab on the palette just to make sure it's looking okay, that my brush isn't contaminated with multiple colors. If I haven't cleaned my brush very well, I'm going to see that there's multiple colors potentially bled together. And that's going to give my miniature sort of a funky looking appearance. Once I'm sure that the brush isn't contaminated, I'm just going to take a dab of the paint and I'm going to just start applying it to the larger areas on the miniature. One thing I'm not going to worry about at this point is detail. I can do this part really, really quickly. I'm just going to apply this and let the brush do the work and let the thinness of the paint do the work. It's going to soak into those cracks and those crevices, as I said before, and I don't really have to do very much. Here's a great example of letting the paint work for you. This still needs to dry a little bit, but you can see that the paint has soaked into those ridges and those little valleys on the miniature itself. So you can see a lot of the detail. You can see almost the pores on the armor. You can see that battle damage here where it looks like a sword is struck through it. You can see these little openings here on the stomach of the creature as well. So this is really good detail, and this is fun. That's why you want to use those thin paints. We're going to allow it to dry for a few minutes. It's actually going to probably take longer to dry the miniature than it did to paint it. It only took about 2 minutes to paint all this. It'll probably take several more minutes to dry it. The next step on painting this Umber Hulk is going to be adding some color variation. If you notice, some of the armor I left unpainted, specifically on the forearms of the creature and on the legs of the creature. I'm going to use a different color, but I'm going to use the same technique. It's going to be a very thin, very watery paint. I'm just going to give it a little bit more sort of character. Having the creature all the same color, it looks interesting, but I think it'll look a little bit better if we have different coloration on the arms and the legs. Our second base coat went on pretty nice. It has a sort of orange-brown color, which goes pretty good with the greenish color. We're going to go ahead and let that dry. And then what we're going to do is focus on some of the details, specifically the claws and maybe the mandibles on this giant beast. We're going to be using a sort of whitish tan color to bring those highlights out. And I'm going to be using a normal paint for this portion. Probably I'm going to be using the detail brush because I want to make sure that I don't get paint everywhere. So what we're going to do for that is just simply take the paint, and this is going to be thicker, and we're going to just start applying it to the claws and to these mandibles, and I'll show you what that looks like when we're done. When we're doing some of this detail, I'm just going to take a bit of the paint and I'm going to paint forward along these nails. I'm going to do it very quickly, and you can see it goes on pretty good, but I'm going to start at the back of the claw and work my way forward. If I have any jerky or jagged motions, I'm not going to contaminate the fingers. I'm going to contaminate nothing but the air. So I'm going to start where the claw ends, and I'm going to move forward. And that's probably the best way to paint. You can make a lot less mistakes. So this quick amount of detail, and it still has yet to dry, so it's a little bit shiny. But you can see the claws and the mandibles are now colored. It will dry, and it'll be slightly lighter when it dries. But what's great about it is that it only takes a matter of seconds to just add this detail, and your miniature is really starting to come alive already. And, you know, we've maybe put 5 to 6 minutes in on actual paint on this, and it's already looking pretty good. To add a little bit more detail to the face, I took red ink and just dabbed it on the eyes. What's interesting about this, you can see that there's actually some detail in the eyes themselves. And by using an ink, I was able to draw out those details instead of losing them with a thick paint. So the face is really coming alive on this creature. Very interesting looking, and it's a lot of fun. The next thing that we're going to do is really highlight some of the ridges on this creature, and we're going to do that by dry brushing. So I have a bright yellow color. What I'm going to do with the dry brush, I'm going to dab it into the paint just a little bit, so I have some on the tip of the brush. Now I'm going to wipe it on the palette and wipe most of it off, so you can see that that's been wiped off. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to dust over the body of the creature, and the little bits of yellow paint are going to stick to the ridges, and it's really going to pop. It's going to make those ridges stand out. And then you have the darker color in the little valleys that we already painted before. So it's going to give you a nice contrast, and it's going to bring out that detail quite a bit. So here's an example of the dry brushing technique. I'm going to take my brush, make sure that most of the paint is off of it, and then I'm just going to dust over the back of the creature. And what it's doing is it's transferring paint to those ridges. Okay, it's a little bit hard to see. So I'm going to do this maybe 5 or 6 times, and after doing that, I'll show you kind of what it looks like. At this point, we have several layers of dry brushing on the back, and you can really see that these ridges are standing out quite nicely. You have a lot of contrast, you have a lot of shadows appearing there, as opposed to on top. I haven't dry brushed the top yet, but if you look at the back, that's pretty cool looking. It's pretty interesting looking. It definitely makes the creature look more natural. So dry brushing is a great technique to really make some of the details pop and stand out. Here's another good example of the dry brush technique, specifically on this ridge along the back of the creature. You can see that it's definitely a lot lighter, and it adds some interesting sort of shading, especially when you turn the miniature in this direction. It almost looks like it has like a mohawk on its back. And that different coloration is really interesting, and it really makes the insect look realistic. So if I just start spinning it, and you can look at some of the dry brushing and what it's done to the carapace, it looks pretty cool. And finally, I went ahead and just dry brushed a few layers of the yellow on the front of the face. It definitely makes it look kind of like a grasshopper, really a nice sort of creepy looking effect on it. Nice and alien. I also added a little bit of the yellow to tone down the color of those antennae that are coming off, and to kind of blend it into the rest of its body. But all in all, I think it turned out pretty good. And these are just some quick techniques that I used to paint this thing. It took me maybe about 15 minutes to do this. And it's a pretty decent miniature. The last step is I'm going to go ahead and darken this base, maybe with that nice brown color, and then we're going to go ahead and call it good. To sum it up, the painting process is fairly simple. First, make sure that you have an undercoat or a primer coat on your miniature. I typically like to recommend a white undercoat, especially when you start painting these miniatures. Next, you're going to use a very thin type of paint, either 2 or 3 different shades, to really fill in those details and those indentations on the miniature to give it that depth and that shadow. Next, go ahead and start painting some of the details on your miniature with thicker paints. Finally, use your dry brushing techniques to really make those ridges and those high points pop on those miniatures. Here's an example of 3 different miniatures by using the same techniques. It took about 20 minutes to make each of these. So you can see that with a very minimal amount of time, you can put some fantastic looking miniatures onto your gaming table. We're going to close out this video with our Umber Hulk. He's feeling pretty powerful now that he's painted, and he is looking pretty good and pretty dangerous. I want to thank you for spending your time with me today. Hopefully you've learned some cool tips and tricks next time you try to paint a miniature for one of your games. I want to thank you again, and as always, have fun gaming.